Hello, this is Math with Beth, and we are going to do midpoint formula and distance formula today. So, midpoint formula means they've given you 2 points and they want you to find the point that is right in the middle. If you graph the point, sometimes you can figure it out just by looking at the graph, but a lot of times it is tricky, especially if there ends up being a decimal or a fraction involved. So this is a formula that always works. It looks fancy, but all this is saying is when you have your 2 points, you're going to add the 2 x's. So remember, when you have a point, the first number is an x, the second one is a y. So if you wanted to, you could call this x1 and y1 because that's the x and y from the first point, x2 and y2 because that's the second point. But really, like I said, if you just think that in your head, what this means is I'm going to add the 2 x's and then I'm going to divide by 2. Why are we dividing by 2? Because basically we're finding the average of the 2 x's. So remember, when you find an average of a bunch of numbers, you add them all up and you divide by how many numbers you have. Well, in the midpoint formula, it's always going to just be 2 points. So we're always going to be adding 2 x's, dividing by 2. And then over here, adding 2 y's, dividing by 2. So our final answer is going to be a point. It's not going to be just one number. It's going to have an x and a y. So let's try one. If I wanted to find the midpoint between these two, so I'm going to find a point. But to find it, I'm going to add the 2 different x's. So the 3 and the -2. And then I'll divide that by 2 in a second. And then for the y point, I'm going to add the 1 and the 3. So remember, it's the y and the y that I'm adding, divided by 2. And now we just do the math. So order of operations, when you have more than one thing happening inside a fraction, you do that first. So we're definitely going to add and then divide by 2. So if I add these 2 numbers, I would get 1. If I add these 2 numbers, I would get 4. And then 1 divided by 2 is 0.5. So you can either leave it 1/2 or change it to 0.5. It depends on if your teacher prefers fractions or decimal. For my class, it's fine either way. And then 4/2 is 2. So your final answer, the point that would be right in the middle of these 2 points, is the point 0.5, 2. So where would that be on a graph? 0.5 means you would just go halfway to the 1 and then up 2. So that would be our midpoint. So let's try it again. So if you want to pause and try this yourself and then check, might be a good idea. But I'm basically just going to add my 2 x's and divide by 2. And then over here, I'm going to add the 2 y's and divide by 2. So that gives me -6/2 and 3/2. So you could reduce -6/2 nicely, because that's just -3. 3/2 cannot be reduced, so you can either leave it as 3/2, or if your teacher's okay with decimals, you can divide it on the calculator or yourself and get 1.5. And that's how you do the midpoint. So now let's look at the distance formula. So midpoint formula gets you an actual point. The distance formula is going to get you a number that just represents how far apart the 2 points are. So what is the distance between them? So another fancy looking formula. So what does this actually mean? This, similar to the midpoint, just means I'm going to take the 2 x's and this time, instead of adding them, I'm going to subtract them. And this means I'm taking the 2 y values and subtracting them. Once you subtract, you're then going to square whatever number that is for both of these cases. And then you will add those 2 numbers together. And then finally, you will take the square root. So with order of operations, make sure you're careful that you understand that the square root is the very last thing we're going to do. So let's do an example. If I wanted to find the distance between these 2 points, and in some formulas, the order is very, very important, but in this formula, it's not, because after we subtract, we're going to square it. So the order doesn't really matter, but I'm going to do it in the way it says up there just in case it would confuse you if I did it differently. So if I consider this my first point and this my second, which again, doesn't matter which one you decide is your first point and your second, I would do the x over here minus the x over here. So 4 minus -5. So be careful. I see this a lot. I see people say 4 minus and then they see a -5, but they think, oh, I've already put the minus, so let me just put a 5. This is not correct because we're supposed to subtract these two numbers. So we're supposed to say 4 minus -5. So there should be two negatives there, which hopefully you know what to do with, but if not, I'll help you in a second. And then for the y's, it would be 2 minus 1. So what does that give us? Well, remember, when you have a number minus another number, so 4 minus -5, you can change those to plus. So minus a negative becomes plus. So really, 4 plus 5 is what we have here. And then 2 minus 1. So again, order of operations is what messes some people up on this. Make sure you now square both numbers. You cannot add these and say, oh, that's the same as 10 squared. It's not. So square each number, then add them together, and then you can take the square root. But in this case, if we tried to take the square root, we would get a decimal. So again, depends on your teacher, but most teachers would want you to then stop here because this is the exact answer, where if you put it in the calculator, you would have to round at some point to write it down because it doesn't work out nicely. Okay, let's try another. So if you want to pause this after I write this down and try it yourself, that might be a good idea. Otherwise, you can watch. But you're only going to learn how to do this if you actually do it. So you should try it yourself. The x minus the x. So again, we have a negative minus a negative. So there's going to be two negatives in there we'll have to deal with in a second. And then 3 minus 0. So -4 minus a -2 really becomes plus. So what is -4 plus 2? -2. And then we're going to square that in a second. And this one becomes 3. Why did I put the parenthesis around this one, but not this one? Because there was a negative. And you'll see if you do it in the calculator, you'll get the wrong answer with a negative if you don't put a parenthesis around it when you go to square it. So I just always write that to remember what to put in the calculator. So if you do put it in the calculator correctly, a negative number squared should always become a positive. And then finally, add them together. So that is the midpoint formula and the distance formula. I hope that helped, and I'll see you next time.